Chapter F.2 of the Anarchist FAQ. What do anarcho-capitalists mean by freedom? For anarcho-capitalists, the concept of freedom is limited to the idea of freedom from. For them, freedom simply means freedom from the initiation of force or the non-aggression against anyone's person and property. Murray Rothbard in For a New Liberty. The notion that real freedom must combine both freedom to and freedom from is missing in their ideology, as is the social context of the so-called freedom they defend. Before continuing, it is useful to quote Alan Hayworth when he notes that, in fact, it is surprising how little close attention the concept of freedom receives from libertarian writers. Once again, anarchy, state, and utopia is a case point. The word freedom doesn't even appear in the index. The word liberty appears, but only to refer the reader to the Will Chamberlain passage in a supposedly libertarian work. This is more than surprising, it is truly remarkable. From Anti-Libertarianism. Why is this the case can be seen from how the right libertarian defines freedom. In right libertarian and anarcho-capitalist ideology, freedom is considered to be a product of property. As Murray Rothbard puts it, the libertarian defines the concept of freedom or liberty as a condition in which a person's ownership rights in his body and his legitimate material or property rights are not invaded, not aggressed against. Freedom and unrestricted property go hand in hand. This definition has some problems, however. In such a society, one cannot legitimately do anything with or on another's property if the owner prohibits it. This means that if an individual's only guaranteed freedom is determined by the amount of property that he or she owns, this has the consequence that someone with no property has no guaranteed freedom at all, beyond, of course, the freedom not to be murdered or otherwise harmed by the deliberate action of others. In other words, a distribution of property is a distribution of freedom, and the right libertarians themselves define it. It strikes anarchists as strange that an ideology that claims to be committed to promoting freedom entails the conclusion that some people should be more free than others. Yet this is the logical implications of their view, which raises serious doubts as to whether anarcho-capitalists are actually interested in freedom at all. Looking at Rothbard's definition of liberty, quoted above, we can see that freedom is actually no longer considered to be a fundamental, independent concept. Instead, freedom is a derivative of something more fundamental, mainly the legitimate rights of an individual, which are identified as property rights. In other words, given that anarcho-capitalists and right libertarians, in general, consider the right to property as absolute, it follows that freedom and property become one and the same. This suggests an alternative name for right-wing libertarian, maybe propertarian. And needless to say, we do not accept the right libertarian view of what constitutes legitimate rights, and their claim to be defenders of liberty is weak. Another important implication of this liberty as property concept is that it produces a strangely alienated concept of freedom. Liberty, as we noted, is no longer considered absolute, but a derivative of property, which has the important consequence that you can sell your liberty and still be considered free by the ideology. This concept of liberty is usually termed self-ownership, but to state the obvious, I do not own myself as if I were an object somehow separable from my subjectivity. I am myself. See section B 4.2. However, the concept of self-ownership is handy for justifying various forms of domination and oppression, For agreeing, usually under the force of circumstances, we must note, to certain contracts, an individual can sell or rent out themselves to others. For example, when workers sell their labor power to capitalists on the free market, in effect, self-ownership becomes the means of justifying treating people as objects. Ironically, the very thing the concept was created to stop. As anarchist L. Susan Brown notes, at the moment an individual sells labor power to another, he or she loses self-determination and instead is treated as a subjectless instrument for the fulfillment of another's will. From The Politics of Individualism. Given that workers are paid to obey, you really have to wonder which planet Murray Rothbard was on when he argued that a person's labor service is alienable, but his will is not, and that he cannot alienate his will, more particularly his control over his own mind and body. He contrasts private property and self-ownership by arguing that all physical property owned by a person is alienable. I can give away or sell another person my shoes, my house, my car, my money, etc. But there are certain vital things which, in natural fact and the nature of man, are inalienable. His will and control over his own person aren't inalienable. From Ethics of Liberty. Yet labor services are unlike the private possessions Rothbard lists as being alienable. As we argued in section B1, a person's labor services and will cannot be divided. If you sell your labor services, you also have to give control of your body and mind to another person. If a worker does not obey the commands of her employer, she is fired. That Rothbard denied this indicates a total lack of common sense. Perhaps Rothbard would have argued that as the workers can quit at any time, she does not really alienate their will. This seems to be the case against slave contracts in section F.2. But this ignores the fact that between the signing and breaking of the contract and during work hours, and perhaps outside work hours if the boss has mandatory drug testing or will fire workers who attend union or anarchist meetings, or those who have an unnatural sexuality and so on, the worker does alienate his will and body. In the words of Rudolf Rocker, under the realities of the capitalist economic form, there can be no talk of a right over one's own person. For that ends when one is compelled to submit to the economic dictation of another, if he does not want to starve. From Anarcho-Syndicalism. Ironically, the rights of property, which are said to flow from an individual's self-ownership of themselves, become the means under capitalism in which self-ownership of non-property owners is denied. The foundational right, self-ownership, becomes denied by the derivation right, ownership of things. To treat others and oneself as property, argues L. Susan Brown, objectifies the human individual, denies the unit of subjectivity and object, and is a negation of individual will, and destroys the very freedom one sought in the first place. The liberal belief in property, both real and in the person, leads not to freedom but to relationships and domination and subordination. Under capitalism, a lack of property can be just as oppressive as a lack of legal rights because of the relationship of domination and subjection the situation creates. That people consent to this hierarchy misses the point. As Alexander Berkman puts it, the law says your employer does not steal anything from you because it is done with your consent. You have agreed to work for the boss for a certain pay, and he to have all that you produce. But do you really consent? When the highwayman holds his gun to your head, you turn your valuables over to him. You consent, all right, but you do so because you cannot help yourself, because you're compelled by his gun. Are you not compelled to work for an employer? Your need compels you just as the highwayman's gun. You must live. You can't work for yourself. The factories, machinery, and tools belong to the employing class, so you must hire yourself out to that class in order to work and live. Whatever you work at, whoever your employer may be, it always comes to the same. You must work for him. You can't help yourself. You are compelled. What is anarchism? Due to this class monopoly over the means of life, workers usually are at a disadvantage in terms of bargaining power. There are more workers than jobs, see Section C now. Within capitalism, there is no equality between owners and the dispossessed, and so property is a source of power. To claim that this power should be left alone or is fair to the anarchists preposterous. Once the state has been established and most of the country's capital privatized, the threat of physical force is no longer necessary to coerce workers into accepting jobs, even with low pay and poor conditions. To use right-wing libertarian Ayn Rand's term, initial force has already taken place by those who now have capital against those who do not. In other words, a thief died and willed his ill-gotten gains to his children, but the children have a right to the stolen property, not legally. So if property is theft, to borrow, crowd hunts quit, and the fruit of exploited labor is simply legal theft, then the only factor giving the children of a deceased capitalist a right to inherit the booty is the law, the state. As Bakunin wrote, ghosts should not rule and oppress this world, which belongs only to the living. Jeff Drogin, from Between Anarchism and Libertarianism. Or, in other words, right-wing libertarianism fails to meet the charge that normal operations of the market systemically places an entire class of people, wage earners, in circumstances that compel them to accept the terms and conditions dictated by those who offer work. While it is true that individuals are formally free to seek better jobs or withhold their labor in the hopes of receiving higher wages, in the end their positions in the market work against them. They cannot live if they do not find employment. When circumstances regularly bestow a relative disadvantage on one class of persons in their dealings with the other class, members of the advantaged class have little need of coercive measure to get what they want. Stephen L. Newman, from Liberalism at Wit's End. Eliminating taxation does not end oppression. In other words, as Tolstoy put it, in Russia, serfdom was only abolished when all the land had been appropriated. When land was granted to the peasants, it was burdened with payments which took the place of planned slavery. In Europe, taxes that kept the people in bondage began to be abolished only when people had lost their land, were unaccustomed to agricultural work, and quite dependent on the capitalists. They abolished the taxes that fall on workers only because the majority of people are already in the hands of the capitalists. One form of slavery is not abolished until another has replaced it, from slavery in our time. So Rothbard's argument, as well as being contradictory, misses the point and the reality of capitalism. Yes, if we define freedom as the absence of coercion, then the idea that wage labor does not restrict liberty is unavoidable. But such a definition is useless. This is because it hides structures of power and relations of domination and subordination. As Carol Pateman argues, the contract in which the worker allegedly sells his labor power is a contract in which he cannot be separated from his capacities. He sells command over the use of his body and himself. To sell command over the use of oneself for a specified period is to be an unfree laborer. The characteristics of this condition are captured in the term wage slave from the sexual contract. In other words, contracts about property in the person inevitably create subordination. Anarcho-capitalism defines the source of unfreedom away, but it still exists and has a major impact on people's liberty. For anarchists, freedom is better described as self-government or self-management, to be able to govern one's own actions if alone, or to participate in the determination of joint activity, part of a group. Freedom, to put it another way, is not an abstract legal concept, but the vital concrete possibility for every human being to bring to full development in their legal powers, capacities, and talents, which nature has endowed them. A key aspect of this is to govern one's own actions when within associations or self-management. If we look at freedom this way, we see that coercion is condemned, but so is hierarchy, so is capitalism. For during working hours, people are not free to make their own plans and have a say in what affects them. They are order takers, not free individuals. It is because anarchists have recognized the authoritarian nature of capitalist firms that they have opposed wage labor and capitalist property rights alongside with them. They have desired to replace opposite institutional structures by subordination with institutions constituted by free relationships, based in other words on self-management in all areas of life, including economic organization. That's Proudhon's argument that the workmen's organizations are full of hope both as protests against the wage system and as affirmations of reciprocity, and that their importance lies in their denial of the rule of capitalists, moneylenders, and governments from the idea of the revolution. Unlike anarchists, the anarcho-capitalist account of freedom allows an individual's freedom to be rented out to others while maintaining that the person is still free. It may seem strange that an ideology proclaiming its support for liberty sees nothing wrong with alienation and denial of liberty, but in fact is unsurprising. After all, contract theory is a theoretical strategy that justifies subjection by presenting it as freedom, and has turned into a subversive proposition that we are born free and equal into defense of civil subjection. Little wonder, then, that contract creates a relation of subordination and not of freedom. Carol Pateman. Little wonder, then, that Colin Ward argues that, as an anarchist, he is by definition a socialist, and that workers' control of industry production is the only approach compatible with anarchism. From Talking Anarchy. Ultimately, any attempt to build an ethical framework starting from the abstract individual, as Rothbard does with his legitimate rights method, will result in domination and oppression between people, not freedom. Indeed, Rothbard provides an example of the dangers of idealist philosophy that Bakunin warned about when he argued that while immaterialism denies free will and ends the establishment of liberty, idealism in the same name of human dignity proclaims free will, and on the ruins of every liberty founds authority, God and the state. This is the case with anarcho-capitalism, can be seen from Rothbard's wholehearted support for wage labor, lordism, and the rules imposed by property owners on those who can use but do not own their property. Rothbard, basing himself on abstract individualism, cannot help but justify authority over liberty. This undoubtedly flows from the right, liberal, and conservative roots of his ideology. Individual anarchist Shauna Wilbar once defined Wikipedia as the most successful modern experiment in promoting obedience to authority as freedom. However, Wikipedia pales into insignificance compared to the success of liberalism in its many forms. In doing precisely that, whether politically or economically, liberalism has always rushed to justify and rationalize the individual subjecting themselves to some form of hierarchy. That anarcho-capitalism does this under the same name, anarchism, is deeply insulting to anarchists. Overall, we can see the logic of the right libertarian definition of freedom ends up negating itself because it results in the creation and encouragement of authority, which is an opposite of freedom. For example, as Ayn Rand pointed out, no man has to sustain his life by his own effort. The man who has no right to the product of his efforts has no means to sustain his life. The man who produces while others dispose of his product, a slave. From the Ayn Rand lexicon, Objectivism from A to Z. But as it was shown in section C2, capitalism is based on, as Proudhon put it, workers working for an entrepreneur who pays them and keeps their products, and so is a form of theft. Thus, by libertarian capitalism's own logic, capitalism is based not on freedom but on wage slavery. for interest, profit, and rent are derived from a worker's unpaid labor. Others dispose of his product. Thus, it is debatable that a right libertarian or anarcho-capitalist society would have less unfreedom or authoritarianism in it than actually existing capitalism. In contrast to anarchism, anarcho-capitalism, with its narrow definitions, restricts freedom to only a few areas of social life and ignores domination and authority beyond those aspects. As Peter Marshall points out, their definition of freedom is entirely negative. It calls for the absence of coercion, but cannot guarantee the positive freedom of individual autonomy and independence from demanding the impossible. By confining freedom to such a narrow range of human actions, anarcho-capitalism is clearly not a form of anarchism. Real anarchists support freedom in every aspect of an individual's life. In short, as French anarchist Élisée Reclus puts it, there is an abyss between two kinds of society, one of which is constituted freely by men of goodwill, based on consideration of their common interests, and another which accepts the existence of either temporary or permanent masters to whom its members owe obedience. Quoted by Mark and Martin in Anarchy, Monarchy, Modernity, and Geography. In other words, when choosing between anarchism and capitalism, anarcho-capitalists pick the latter and call it the former.